The door to Thomas Redmond's ranch house swung open before Ellen Slater could even raise her fist to knock, and the man who filled the frame was nothing like the image she had carried in her heart for 7 years. He was broader now, the kind of broad that came from hauling fence posts and breaking horses, not the lean boy she remembered. His dark hair had threads of silver at the temples, though he could not have been more than 35. His jaw was set like quarried stone, and his eyes, those same deep gray eyes she had never quite managed to forget, swept over her with something between surprise and wariness, the way a man looks at something dangerous that has wandered onto his land uninvited. "Mrs. Slater," he said, and the fact that he knew her name immediately sent a small tremor through her chest. Then the wariness shifted, and what replaced it was something worse: polite blankness. The face a man puts on when he wants to make it clear that whatever you are carrying toward him, he has no intention of taking it from your hands. Ellen had rehearsed this moment in the wagon the entire 3 days from Amarillo. She had words prepared, clean and simple words, the kind that could not be mistaken for anything other than what they were: a debt repaid, a kindness returned, a ledger closed. But standing here on Thomas Redmond's porch in the fading copper light of a Texas October, with the smell of cedar smoke and dry grass in the air, and the distant sound of cattle settling for the evening, every single one of those prepared words dissolved like sugar in rain. "I came," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, "because I owe you something. 7 years is too long to carry a debt, Thomas." Something moved behind his eyes. It was quick, the way a fish turns in dark water, there and gone before she could name it. "I don't know what debt you're talking about," he said. And the worst part, the part that hit her like a physical blow to the sternum, was that he said it gently, not dismissively, not cruelly. He said it the way a kind man tells a grieving woman that her husband looked peaceful at the end, meaning to ease her, not knowing that the gentleness itself is the wound. "You don't remember," she said. It was not a question. "I'm sorry," Thomas Redmond said, and stepped back from the door. "But you've come a long way. Come inside and tell me what you think I've done." Ellen Slater had buried one man she loved and survived it. She had not expected that 4 quiet words, "I have forgotten you," delivered without malice on a Texas porch at sunset, would come so close to undoing everything she had rebuilt in the 7 years since. She picked up the envelope she had set on the railing and walked inside. 7 years earlier, the spring of 1878 had come to the Texas Panhandle like a debt collector, sudden and unforgiving. Ellen had not been Ellen Slater then. She had been Ellen Marsh, 22 years old, 3 months into a disastrous marriage to a man named Carl Marsh, who had promised her a homestead and delivered her a half-rotted claim shanty 40 miles from the nearest town, with a well that had gone bad with alkali, and a husband who had discovered, somewhere between Missouri and Texas, that he preferred whiskey to farming. The spring storm that changed everything came on a Tuesday. Carl had ridden to Tascosa 2 days before and had not come back, which was not unusual. Ellen had been trying to repair the roof of the shanty herself, having watched rain come through it the previous night, and ruined the last of the cornmeal she had been rationing since February. She was on the roof when the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind went from persistent to murderous in the space of 20 heartbeats. The storm that tore through that part of the Panhandle in April of 1878 was what old-timers still talked about 15 years later. It was not a tornado, though it produced 3 of them. It was the kind of rotating thunderstorm that seemed to have a personal grievance with the land beneath it, dropping hail the size of hens' eggs and producing straight-line winds that could knock a loaded freight wagon off a road. Ellen came off the roof when the first gust hit her. She fell 12 feet and landed badly, twisting her left ankle and striking her head hard enough on the frozen ground to put gray stars across her vision. She lay there in the rising wind with the rain coming sideways and her head ringing, and the very logical part of her brain informing her that she was going to die out here alone, which was a terrible and ignominious way to end. and the slightly less logical part of her brain insisting that she get up and get to the root cellar before that happened. She did not make it to the root cellar. She had managed to get upright and take perhaps 6 steps before her ankle buckled and she went down again, and that was where Thomas Redmond found her. He was riding dispatch for a cattle outfit, carrying a message from one ranch foreman to another, and he had no business being within 8 miles of her claim that afternoon. But a wrong fork in an unfamiliar part of the Panhandle had put him on a track he did not know, and the track had led him past the half-rotted shanty just as Ellen Marsh went down the second time in the open yard with the sky exploding overhead. He had not hesitated. That was the thing she had never been able to stop thinking about. He had not slowed his horse and assessed the situation from a safe distance. He had simply come off his horse at a run in the middle of a killing storm, gotten an arm around her, half carried in half, dragged her to the root cellar, pulled the door shut over them both, and held the rope handle while the world dismantled itself overhead. They had been in that root cellar together for 4 hours. 4 hours in complete darkness except for the occasional white flare of lightning through the cracks in the door planks. 4 hours with the sound of the storm trying to peel the world apart above them. He had spoken to her the whole time, not constantly, not in the frantic way of a man trying to drown out his own fear, but steadily. The way a lamp burns steadily. He told her his name was Thomas Redmond, and that he worked for the McCready outfit, and that he was from Denton County originally. He told her the name of his horse, which was Caleb, and that Caleb would have gotten into the Linta by now because that horse had more sense than any man he'd ever worked with. He told her that the storm would pass because all storms passed, which was not a comforting thing to say to most people, but was, in the particular darkness of that particular cellar on that particular afternoon, exactly what Ellen Marsh needed to hear. When the storm finally eased and Thomas Redmond pushed the cellar door open to a landscape that looked like the land had been turned inside out, he had assessed her ankle, pronounced it badly sprained but not broken, and carried her to the shanty on his back because the yard was knee-deep in debris. He had found his horse, which had indeed gotten into the lean-to and was unharmed, and he had tied the animal and spent the next 2 hours helping Ellen clear the worst of the storm damage and make the shanty habitable again. He had not asked about her husband. She had not volunteered anything about him. Thomas Redmond had done what needed doing with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that some people's circumstances were their own private territory, and then he had taken his hat from the peg by the door, said, "You'll want to get that ankle looked at when you can manage the ride to town," and gone. He had not left a name. He had not asked for thanks. He had given her no opportunity to say what she needed to say, which was that she had never in her 22 years been certain that a pure and uncomplicated act of human decency existed in the world until that afternoon, and that whatever it cost, whatever it required of her, she intended to repay it. By the time she managed to get to Tascosa 4 days later, nobody at the McCready outfit could tell her much. Thomas Redmond had delivered his message, collected his pay, and moved on. Riders did that. They came through like weather, left their marks, and were gone. Carl Marsh came back from Tascosa 6 days after the storm. He assessed the damage to the shanty and the fact that his wife was limping and seemed to have gotten the worst of the roof repaired without him, and he accepted all of it without comment. They stayed on that claim for 3 more years, years that Ellen would later describe to no one because they were hers alone to carry, and then Carl Marsh died of a fever in the winter of 1881, and Ellen became Ellen Slater when she married a decent man named George Slater in the spring of 1882. George Slater was good to her. He was patient and careful, and he understood that she had survived something before him that she was not going to talk about in detail, and he respected that boundary. He built her a proper house in Amarillo and ran a modest but honest cattle operation, and gave her 5 good years before his heart gave out in the spring of 1887, quietly in his sleep, which was the kindest way a man could go, and which left Ellen a widow at 31 with a house, a modest inheritance, and enough time on her hands to finally sit still with all the things she had been outrunning for years. The thought of Thomas Redmond had never entirely left her. That was the secret she had kept longest, the one that had nothing to do with Carl's cruelty or George's goodness or any of the practical facts of her life. In the root cellar in the spring of 1878, in the dark with the world coming apart overhead, Thomas Redmond's voice had been the most anchoring thing she had ever experienced, and she had carried that anchor through everything that followed without quite understanding what she was carrying. She had not let herself call it anything other than a debt owed. It was safer that way. It had a clean shape, a debt. You repaid it and it was done. She had spent 3 months after George's death quietly searching. Letters to ranch outfits, questions asked in Tascosa, a slow following of the thread through 10 years of the Panhandle cattle trade, until a retired drover named Pete Hutchins in a boarding house in Canadian Texas had said, "Tom Redmond. Sure, I know Tom. He's got his own spread now down near Clarendon. Little place called the Red Fork Ranch, probably 40 miles south of here." And so Ellen Slater had packed a single trunk, settled her affairs in Amarillo, and driven a rented wagon 3 days south through the October grasslands of the Texas Panhandle to return a kindness she had owed for 7 years. She had not entirely expected to find that the man she owed it to had forgotten all about it. Thomas Redmond's kitchen was cleaner than she had expected for a bachelor, which was the first thing she noticed as she sat down at the table with the envelope in her hands. There was a cast iron stove that showed signs of regular use, a shelf of canned goods arranged with a neatness that suggested habit rather than vanity, and a window above the dry sink that looked west toward the last of the sunset, burning orange and deep red over the flat grassland. He put coffee on without being asked and sat down across from her with the particular careful stillness of a man who has learned to wait things out. "Tell me about this debt," he said. Ellen placed the envelope on the table between them. April of 1878. A storm. A claim shanty 40 miles west of Tascosa. A woman on the ground in the yard and a root cellar. She watched his face. She watched it the way she had watched the sky on the morning of that storm, looking for the sign that told you what was actually coming. Something happened. Something quiet and significant, like a plate shifting deep underground. He was very still for a moment, and then he said, "Ellen Marsh." It came out of him slowly, the name, as if it had been sealed somewhere and the seal had not been broken in a very long time. "You do remember," she said. "I remember," he said. He looked at the envelope and then at her, and there was something in his face now that she could not read, something layered and complicated like the rings of a felled tree. "I told you I'd forgotten. You told me you didn't know what debt I was talking about. That's not the same thing." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, and Ellen noticed for the first time that his left hand had a scar across the knuckles, an old one, long-heeled and white against the weather-dark skin. "I didn't want you to feel obligated." Ellen Slater had prepared for many versions of this encounter in her 3 days on the road. She had prepared for warmth and welcome. She had prepared for confusion. She had prepared, in her least charitable moments of imagination, for coldness or dismissal. She had not prepared for this, for the possibility that Thomas Redmond had spent 7 years carrying the same awareness of that afternoon that she had, and that his response to her arriving on his porch had been to try to set her free of it. The thing she felt in that moment was not easy to name. It was something between gratitude and anger, the way you feel when someone tries to protect you from something you needed to carry, has taken it from you without asking and left you without the weight you had come to depend on. "You could have let me say thank you," she said. "You didn't need to come 3 days across the Panhandle to say thank you." "I didn't come just to say thank you." She touched the envelope. "My late husband left me in comfortable circumstances. The money in here is enough to let a man make a good start or improve what he already has. It's yours. I want you to have it." Thomas Redmond looked at the envelope the way a man looks at something he very much wants that he has already decided not to take. "Ellen," he said, and her name in his mouth was a different thing than she had expected. "Careful, like something breakable. You don't owe me money for pulling a woman out of a storm." "It's not a payment for a service rendered," she said. "It's an act of gratitude from one person to another. There is a difference." "I know there is," he said, "but I can't take your money." "Why not?" He looked at her steadily. "Because I remember that afternoon," he said, "and what I remember isn't something that has a dollar value attached to it." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the daylight was going, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the deep blue above the western grassland. A horse in the near corral made a soft sound, and somewhere further out, a coyote began its evening announcement to the world. "You saved my life," Ellen said quietly. "The storm would probably have passed before it killed you. The storm had already knocked me unconscious once. My ankle was badly damaged. I was alone, and there was no shelter I could reach on my own." She met his eyes, and the gray in them in the lamplight was like deep water on a cloudy day. "You saved my life, Thomas Redmond, and I have spent 7 years needing to say so, and I will not let you take that from me either." Something in his face changed. The careful distance he had been maintaining since she walked in, the polite management of a man who has trained himself not to want things too readily, shifted slightly. "Not much, just enough." "All right," he said softly. "Then say it." "Thank you," Ellen Slater said. "For the storm, and for the cellar, and for the roof, and for Caleb the horse, and for telling me that all storms pass." Her voice was perfectly level. "Thank you for being the one decent thing that happened to me in a very long stretch of years when decency was in short supply." Thomas Redmond did not say anything for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup and then back at her, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its careful management. "You mentioned a late husband," he said. "When did you lose him?" "Last spring. George Slater. He was a good man." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She looked around the kitchen with its orderly canned goods and clean stove. "And you? No family of your own?" Something crossed his face that she could not quite catch. "No," he said. "I came close once. It didn't come to anything." Ellen stayed that night at the Red Fork Ranch because Thomas Redmond pointed out, with the same straightforward practicality she remembered from the root cellar, that it was full dark and she was alone, and the nearest town was 12 miles off, and the road between here and there had 2 creek crossings that were unreliable at night. He gave her the room he used for a guest, which had a good clean bed and a quilt that smelled of cedar, and he told her that breakfast was at 6 and that she should sleep well and not worry about anything. She lay in the dark and listened to the absolute silence of the Panhandle at night, which was its own kind of roaring, and tried to understand what she was feeling. She had come here to close a ledger. She had come with an envelope and a set of prepared words and a clear plan for driving away afterward with her debt discharged and her conscience settled. She had not come here to sit in a lamplit kitchen while a gray-eyed man said her name like something breakable, or to notice the white scar on his knuckles and wonder how it got there, or to feel the particular specific ache of a woman who has been alone for 7 months and has just, for the first time in those 7 months, felt completely present in a room with another human being. She had not come here for any of that. She told herself this firmly, turned over in the cedar-smelling dark, and did not sleep for a very long time. In the morning, the Red Fork Ranch looked entirely different from how it had appeared at dusk. The previous evening it had been a collection of structures in the diminishing light, significant only as shelter. In the October morning sun, it revealed itself as something a man had built carefully and with intention. The main house was a solid frame structure, not large but well made, with a covered porch along the south and east sides. There were 2 good corrals, a barn that was newer than the house, a chicken run, and beyond those buildings, the beginning of the open pasture that rolled away south and west in golden grass as far as she could see. Thomas Redmond was already in the near corral when Ellen came out in the early morning, working with a young horse that was not yet decided about the saddle. He was patient with the animal in the same way he had been patient in the root cellar, not forcing anything, just being present and consistent until the thing he was asking became the obvious and comfortable choice. Ellen leaned on the fence rail and watched without announcing herself, and the horse, which had been rolling its eyes and skittering sideways a moment before, gradually settled. He noticed her after a few minutes. "Coffee's on the stove," he said, without looking up from the horse. "I can wait," she said. He did look up then, briefly, with something that might have been surprise, and then something else she did not have a name for yet. She watched him work the horse for another 20 minutes before he put the animal back, and came to lean on the fence on his side of it. They were perhaps 4 feet apart with the top rail between them, and the morning sun was behind her and the light was hitting his face directly, and Ellen thought that he was a more handsome man than she had allowed herself to fully register the night before. "You don't have to stay," he said. "You've said what you came to say." "I know," she said. "But—" She had not meant for there to be a but. She was disconcerted to discover that there apparently was one. "Your operation here," she said, looking out over the ranch with what she hoped was a general and impersonal interest. "It looks well established. How long have you had it?" "4 years," he said. "Bought the land in '83, got the house up in '84. He seemed to decide something. "Come have breakfast and I'll tell you about it. If you're going to stay another hour, we might as well sit down." Breakfast at the Red Fork Ranch was biscuits made from scratch, which Thomas Redmond produced from the oven with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who had been feeding himself for a long time, along with thick-sliced salt pork and black coffee, and a jar of sorghum syrup. Ellen, who had not eaten properly since the second day of the drive, and had not slept well and was slightly disoriented by all of it, found herself eating more than she had intended while Thomas Redmond told her about the ranch. He had come to the Panhandle from Denton County in 1875 at 23 years old, riding dispatch and doing any cattle work he could find. He had worked for 5 different outfits over 8 years, saved nearly every dollar he earned, and bought this land from a man who had decided the Panhandle had broken his spirit one winter too many. "Did it break yours?" Ellen asked. Thomas considered this with the seriousness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, the habit of actually thinking before answering. "No," he said at last. "I think I'm built for it. The space suits me." He paused. "Some people need walls close in. I need to be able to see a long way." Ellen looked out the south window at the grassland going off to the horizon. "I understand that," she said. "Do you? Amarillo is a real town now." "It is. And I was grateful for it when I had it." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "George's house, George's furniture, George's town, really. My name on the deed, but his shape in everything." She paused, surprised at herself. "I don't miss it the way I thought I would." Thomas Redmond was watching her with the focused attention that she was also beginning to recognize as characteristic, the way he looked at the young horse in the corral, not pressing, just present. "What will you do?" he asked. "I'm not entirely certain," she admitted, and the admission felt strange in her mouth, not because she was unaccustomed to uncertainty, but because she was unaccustomed to saying it out loud without flinching. She stayed a second night, this time because a cold front came through in the afternoon, and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in the space of 2 hours, which was the Panhandle's particular talent, and Thomas Redmond pointed out again, with the same practical matter-of-factness, that this was not weather for traveling. She did not argue. Over the course of that second day, the thing that had been tentative and careful between them began, slowly and without declaration, to expand. They spent the afternoon together in a way that was not quite work and not quite conversation, but something between them, cleaning and oiling harness in the barn, while the wind roared outside and the cold pressed against the walls. And Thomas told her about the ranch's 2 hired hands who were currently up north with the fall cattle drive, and about his neighbor to the east, an older German settler named Brower who had claimed land here in 1877 and was still fighting the Panhandle to a standstill on principle. Ellen told him about Amarillo, about the town it had been when she arrived and what it was now, a real town with a hotel and a bank and a newspaper and ambitions. She told him about George's cattle business, which she had helped him manage the books for, and which had taught her more about the practical realities of ranching than most women in the territory knew. Thomas listened to all of this with attention that was not polite and not obligatory but genuine, and Ellen became aware, in the lamplit warmth of the barn with the cold wind outside, that she was not talking to fill silence. She was telling him things she had not told anyone, not because they were secrets, but because there had not previously been anyone she wanted to tell. "You said you came close to family once," she said, late that afternoon, because she had been thinking about it since the night before, and she was discovering a person who would rather say the thing than carry it. Thomas was very still for a moment. "A woman in Canyon," he said. "About 3 years ago. We talked about marriage." He picked up a length of harness and began to work the leather with methodical focus. She decided she wanted someone with a more established future. A man with a town business, not a ranch that might fail. "You don't seem bitter about it," Ellen said. "I was for a while," he said honestly. "Then I thought about it and decided she was probably right about herself, just not right about me. She needed something I couldn't give her, and I would have spent my life trying to give it and making both of us unhappy." He looked up briefly. "Some things you think are a loss are actually a clarification." Ellen thought about Karl Marsh, about the years of trying to become something that fit into the shape of his expectations, about the slow erosion of a person trying to accommodate a world that was never going to accommodate them back. "Yes," she said, "I know exactly what you mean." The second evening was different from the first. There was less careful management on both sides. They sat on the south porch after supper despite the cold because the sky had cleared, and the stars over the Panhandle were extraordinary. The kind of sky that made the vastness of the universe feel like companionship rather than indifference. And Thomas brought out 2 blankets, and they sat in the wooden chairs with the blankets across their laps, and talked for 2 hours with the kind of ease that should have taken much longer to develop. He told her about the dark past of the Panhandle cattle trade, about the violence of the early '80s and the fence-cutting wars, and the way the big outfits had tried to absorb or destroy every small rancher who got in their way. He told her about watching men he respected lose their land to legal maneuvers they could not afford to fight, about the injustices that were woven into the fabric of the territory's history like thread you could not pull out without the whole cloth coming apart. Ellen told him about the years with Karl, not in detail, not with the full weight of it, but enough that he understood that she had come from something hard before she came to anything good. She told him because it seemed dishonest not to, because he had been straightforwardly honest with her, and she wanted to be the same with him, and because there was something about this particular man in this particular place, under this particular sky, that made the truth feel like the natural language. He did not say he was sorry in a way that suggested she was pitiable. He said that took a kind of strength most people don't know they have until they need it. And then he moved on, not dwelling on it, not making it into the largest thing about her, which was exactly the right response. Around 11 o'clock, when the cold had become serious and they had been sitting in companionable silence for a while, Thomas said, "You don't have to go tomorrow, Ellen." She turned to look at him, and in the starlight his profile was very still. "You said yourself you don't have obligations pulling you back," he continued. "If you want to stay a few more days, there's no reason you shouldn't." Ellen Slater was 31 years old and had been managing her own life, with varying degrees of success and support, since she was 22. She was not a woman who needed permission from anyone. She was also not a woman who had learned to stop wanting things she was afraid to want. "All right," she said. "A few more days." The few more days became a week, and then 2 weeks, and by the 3rd week something had shifted so fundamentally that both of them had stopped pretending they had not noticed it. The days had a shape to them now. Early mornings, when Ellen would come out to the kitchen and find the coffee already made and Thomas already somewhere on the ranch doing the first work of the day. And she would take her coffee out to the fence where she could watch him work, and he would notice her, and there would be a moment between them that had no particular content except presence. Late mornings when she would work alongside him at whatever the ranch needed, because she had not come this far and lived this hard to be a person who sat idle when there was work to be done, and her practical knowledge of ranching accounts had already been useful in a way that pleased her. Afternoons when the light went golden over the grassland and the work had eased enough for conversation, when they would sit on the porch or walk the fence line and talk. She was learning the ranch the way she had learned the Amarillo books, methodically and with genuine interest, and she was learning Thomas Redmond the same way, piece by piece, with the growing conviction that what she was finding was not a simple thing. He was a man with a very particular kind of integrity that she recognized because it was rare. He did not say things he did not mean. He did not promise things he was uncertain about. He did not try to manage her expectations or her feelings or her sense of him. He was simply himself, consistently and without performance, and in a world that had offered her Karl Marsh's bluster and George Slater's careful gentleness, this felt like a discovery. She was also discovering things that complicated the clean simplicity of returned kindness and discharged debt. She was noticing the way he laughed, which was rare but genuine, and which transformed his face from something guarded into something open. She was noticing the way he spoke about the land, not with the possessive greed of a man who sees territory as conquest, but with the particular love of someone who has found the exact place in the world where they belong. She was noticing, and she was honest enough with herself to admit this even in the private territory of her own mind, that she had stopped thinking about this visit as a departure and had started, without quite intending to, thinking about it as a beginning. On the 16th day of her stay, Thomas Redmond's 2 hands came back from the cattle drive. Their names were Dave Castillo and a younger man called Whitfield, who everyone called Whit, a sandy-haired young man of about 24 who looked at Ellen with undisguised curiosity, and then, when Thomas gave him a look, with carefully disciplined politeness. Dave was older, 40 or so, with a broad, weathered face and an economy of expression that suggested he had seen a great many things and rated most of them interesting but not worth excessive commentary. The return of the hired hands changed the texture of the days. The ranch became busier, louder in the productive way of a working operation rather than the silence of a man alone. There were more horses to work, more cattle to check on, fence that needed attention before winter settled in seriously. Thomas was less available for the long afternoon conversations, and Ellen found herself adapting, helping where she could, staying out of the way where she couldn't, and discovering that she was perfectly comfortable on this ranch in a way that she had not felt comfortable anywhere since before Karl Marsh. Dave watched her with those careful eyes of his and said very little. On the 3rd day after the return, he found her alone in the kitchen putting up the dinner things, and he said, without preamble, "You planning on leaving soon?" Ellen turned to look at him. "I haven't decided," she said honestly. Dave nodded as if this was the answer he had expected. "He's been different since you came," he said. "Better different, but different." He picked up his hat from the table. "Just thought you should know." He walked out. It was less subtle. On a cold morning when he and Ellen were both in the barn at the same time, him dealing with a horse's thrown shoe and her checking on a calf that Thomas had brought in from the cold the night before, he said, "Mr. Redmond seems real happy, ma'am, if you don't mind me saying so." Ellen scratched the calf behind its ears. "I'm glad," she said carefully. "He hasn't been." Whit paused, looking for the right words. "He hasn't had much reason to be the last couple years, since the woman in Canyon. He told me about that." "Did he?" Whit sounded genuinely surprised. "He doesn't generally talk about it." He bent back to the horse's hoof. "That's something then." That night after supper, after Dov and Whit had gone to the bunkhouse, Thomas and Ellen sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the wind pressing at the windows, and the thing that had been building between them for weeks was finally too present to pretend was not there. "Ellen," Thomas said and stopped. She waited. "I want to ask you something, and I want to be honest about why I'm asking it, because I don't want to do you a disservice." "All right," she said. "I have been happy," he said, in the straightforward way he said everything, "since you came. I have been happy in a way I had stopped expecting to be." He was looking at her steadily, and the gray of his eyes in the lamplight was warm, which she would not have thought possible. "I don't want you to leave." Ellen Slater was very quiet for a moment. The wind pushed at the kitchen window, and the lamp flame moved gently, and the calf in the barn made a small sound, and the Panhandle night pressed its enormous starry weight down over everything. "I don't want to leave," she said. Thomas Redmond reached across the table and took her hand. His hand was large and work-rough and entirely gentle, and the warmth of it went straight through her, in a way that was nothing like the careful affection George had offered, and nothing like the cold absence that had preceded George. And she understood in that moment that she had been building toward this since a root cellar in the spring of 1878, since a gray-eyed man's voice in the dark telling her that all storms passed. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Because you've been honest with me and I want to be honest with you." She kept her hand in his. "When I came here 3 weeks ago, I told myself I was coming to return a debt, to close a ledger and be done with it." She looked at him steadily. "I don't think that's entirely true. I think I have been carrying you around in my head for 7 years, and I think part of why I had to find you was that I needed to know whether the man I remembered was real." "And you're more real than I remembered," she said. Thomas Redmond's thumb moved across the back of her hand, a small and deliberate gesture. "I thought about you," he said quietly. "After that spring. I thought about that afternoon more than I had any particular reason to. A woman I'd spent 4 hours with in a cellar and would probably never see again." He shook his head slightly. "I told myself it was because the storm was significant, because anyone would have done the same. But," she said with a small smile, "but I was glad I'd been the one there," he said simply. "I was glad it was me." They sat like that for a long time, with the lamp burning between them and the wind outside and their hands together on the table, and there was nothing in that moment that required words, which was perhaps the clearest sign of all of what was building between them. He kissed her for the first time on the south porch on a cold, clear morning 11 days later, because by that point the thing between them had become so substantial and so known that a kiss was simply the honest acknowledgement of it. It was not tentative in the way of people who are uncertain about each other. It was the kiss of two people who have been certain for a while and have been finding their way toward saying so. Ellen's hands were against the front of his coat and his hands were at her shoulders, and the kiss was warm and unhurried, and when it ended she pressed her forehead against his jaw and felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely located. "I would very much like to ask you to stay," Thomas said against her hair. "Not for a few more days, for good." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "You're talking about marriage," she said. "Yes," simple and direct the way he said everything. "If you'll consider it." Ellen Slater considered it for about 3 seconds, which was not nearly as long as it should have taken given that she was a widow of 7 months' standing who had arrived 3 weeks ago with an envelope and a plan to leave, but some things were exactly as long as they needed to be and no longer. "Yes," she said. "The difficulties, naturally, did not simply disappear because 2 people decided to be happy." Thomas had a ranch with 2 hands and a third-year operation that had not yet achieved the stability he needed it to have. Ellen had a house in Amarillo and a set of affairs to settle before she could, with clear conscience, make a permanent life somewhere else. These were practical realities, and they engaged with them practically. Ellen drove back to Amarillo in the first week of November, a drive she found very different from the drive south in October, primarily because she now knew exactly where she was going afterward, and the envelope was still in her trunk, and her heart was doing something it had not done in years. Something she was not quite ready to name in daylight, but that kept her company through the 3 days of flat grass and pale sky between the Red Fork Ranch and the house on the edge of town that had George Slater's shape in everything. She spent 3 weeks in Amarillo settling the estate properly, which involved more correspondence and several meetings with the bank and a lawyer named Hendricks who had managed George's affairs and who was professionally supportive of her decision, but personally somewhat bewildered by it. She sold the house to a couple newly arrived from Missouri who were delighted by it. She kept a selection of her own things and George's books, which she had always loved more than he had, and she arranged for the rest to be disposed of fairly. She wrote to Thomas every 3 days, careful letters that she was somewhat embarrassed by the romanticism of, but that she sent anyway, because she was 31 years old, and she had already spent too many years being careful about wanting things. His letters back were shorter and less romantic in their vocabulary, but contained, in their directness and specificity, more genuine affection than she had received in years of careful convention. His last letter before she left Amarillo said, "The spare room is ready. Bring everything you want to bring. Caleb's successor would like to meet you. I would very much like you to be here." She was back at the Red Fork Ranch on the 22nd of November, 1887, with her trunk and her books and the envelope still in her possession, because she had thought of a better use for it than leaving it on a kitchen table. She arrived in the early afternoon, and Thomas came off the porch before the wagon stopped and helped her down, and there was a quality to the way he looked at her that she thought she could probably live inside for the rest of her life without it losing its warmth. "I thought of something on the way here," she said, once they were inside and the trunk was off the wagon. "Tell me," he said. She put the envelope on the table between them, the same table where she had put it the first night. "I'd like to put this toward the ranch," she said. "Not as a gift, as an investment. If we're going to build this together, then we're going to build it together." Thomas looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Together," he said. "Together," she confirmed. He picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, and then set it down again with the resolution of a man who has made a decision he will not reconsider. "All right," he said. "Together." They were married in Clarendon on the 15th of December, 1887, in the simple ceremony of a justice of the peace, with Dove Castillo and Whit Whitfield as witnesses and Thomas Brower, the German neighbor, in attendance, who brought a bottle of German brandy and cried, which surprised everyone except apparently himself. The justice of the peace, a man named Gorman who seemed gratified by the unusual steadiness of the couple before him, said afterward that he had married a great many people in his tenure, and that he believed he had just married 2 people who actually understood what they were doing, which he considered a significant rarity. Ellen wore a deep blue wool dress that she had bought in Amarillo, knowing she would wear it for this, and Thomas wore his best coat, which was dark and fit him well. And when they walked out of the justice's office into the cold December sunlight of Clarendon, Thomas put her hand through his arm and kept it there, and she pressed her fingers against his coat sleeve and felt the solid warmth of him, and thought that the thing she had tried to call a debt for 7 years had always been something larger than that, and that the storm in the spring of 1878 had been the beginning of a story that had taken 9 years to find its next page. The winter of their first year together was hard in the way that Panhandle winters are hard, which is to say relentlessly and without particular malice, just the wind and the cold, and the long gray stretches of days when the sky sits on the land like a lid, and the work of keeping everything alive requires all of a person's attention and most of their strength. They were good at it together, which surprised neither of them because they had each been surviving hard things alone for long enough to recognize a capable partner. Ellen managed the ranch accounts with the same careful precision she had brought to George's books, and the clarity she introduced to the Red Fork's financial picture revealed both a problem and an opportunity. The problem was that Thomas had been extending credit to a neighbor to the north, a young rancher named Garrett, who had borrowed against a cattle note he was unlikely to ever pay back. The opportunity was that the grassland east of Brower's property was coming up for sale, and they could afford it, now, with the money from the envelope applied to the existing assets. Thomas negotiated with the seller, a land company out of Fort Worth that had bought up distressed claims in the early 80s and was now liquidating. And he negotiated well because he was a patient man who understood what he wanted and refused to be rushed. They acquired the additional land in February of 1888, which added 400 acres of good grass to the Red Fork and made the ranch a genuinely viable operation rather than a promising one. Ellen Slater Redmond rode that new land the first dry day in March, on a mare Thomas had matched to her, a steady, reliable bay called Josephine who had no dramatic qualities but an entire lifetime's worth of sense. She rode the east boundary in the thin early spring sunlight and looked at the grassland that was technically, legally, actually hers in partnership with the man she had married, and felt something so completely settled in herself that it was almost physical. She had been built for this, she thought, not for the root cellar or the years before it or the patient goodness of George Slater's house in Amarillo. She had been built for this specific combination of land and work in partnership, for the particular life that had been assembling itself since the April afternoon when a gray-eyed man on a horse had come off the saddle at a run and pulled her out of the path of a storm. By spring she was carrying their first child, which she and Thomas greeted with the particular joy of people who had each arrived at this point by longer and harder roads than they had wanted, and who understood therefore that it was not a given, not a guarantee, but a specific and particular piece of grace. The baby was born in November of 1888, a boy, which Thomas received with an expression that Ellen catalogued as the most unguarded she had ever seen on his face, a kind of overwhelmed quietness that was entirely different from his usual steadiness, and which lasted several days before settling into the deep calm pride that became, thereafter, characteristic of how he looked at his son. They named him James, after Thomas's father, who had died when Thomas was 16, and whose memory Thomas carried with the kind of careful respect that spoke well of both the father and the son. James Redmond arrived in the world healthy and demanding and profoundly opinionated, which the two hands, Dov and Wit, took as evidence that he was going to fit in well on the Red Fork. The Panhandle in the late 1880s was changing. The era of the great cattle drives was winding down as the railroads extended their reach, and the open range was being broken up by fence and deed. The injustices of that transition were not small. The concentration of land in the hands of the large outfits, the displacement of small ranchers who had been on the land before the money arrived, the difficulty of making a legitimate claim stick against the weight of capital and legal maneuvers. Thomas engaged with these realities with the same steady integrity he brought to everything, serving on a territorial committee that sought to establish fair water rights and advocating, in the plain-spoken way of a man without political ambitions, but with actual convictions, for the smaller operators against the consolidating pressure of the big outfits. Ellen wrote letters. She had, it turned out, a clear and forceful written voice, and she used it in letters to the Clarendon newspaper and later to the Panhandle newspapers in Amarillo, writing under her own name about the practical realities of small ranching operations and the consequences of letting the legal structure of land ownership be determined entirely by the richest party's lawyer. This was not a universally popular position, but it was an honest one, and in the territories in the late 1880s, there were enough people who agreed with it to make the letters worth writing. The old neighbor Brower, who had watched the Red Fork with approval from the day of the wedding, came over one spring afternoon in 1889 with a proposition. He was getting old, he said, without self-pity, and with the directness of a man who has faced harder things than mortality. He had no children, and he wanted to know if the Redmonds would consider a purchase arrangement on his land when the time came, a fair price paid over time, and the guarantee that the Brower name would remain on the Eastern Range as a place name in perpetuity, which was a small and touching request, and which Thomas agreed to immediately and without negotiation. Brower shook Thomas's hand and then, unexpectedly, took Ellen's hand in both of his and said, in his careful accented English, "You are a good woman for this land, Mrs. Redmond. This land has a dark past. It needs good people." Ellen thanked him and meant it. James was a year and a half old and already walking in the determined, lurching way of a toddler with ambitions larger than his current motor capacity when Ellen told Thomas she was carrying their second child. This news arrived in the spring of 1890, when the Red Fork was in its best season yet, the grass coming in strong after a good winter, the herd expanded with the Brower Range supplementing their existing acreage, the accounts in the clearest order they had ever been. Thomas, who had by now 4 years of practice in receiving significant news without losing his fundamental steadiness, took her hands and held them and looked at her with that particular warmth she had come to think of as hers specifically, the warmth he did not turn toward anyone else. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the thing that mattered to him first. "Very well," she said. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "James is going to be insufferable about this." Ellen laughed, which was something she did with great regularity now, more than she had known she had the capacity for when she drove the wagon south in October of 1887 with her envelope and her prepared words. Thomas made her laugh often, not through comedy exactly, but through the dry and honest observations of a man who saw the world clearly and was not above pointing out when it was being funny. The second child was a girl, born in the deep cold of January 1891, and they named her Catherine, which had been Ellen's grandmother's name, and which suited her immediately because she arrived with an expression of calm assessment that suggested she was going to spend her life deciding what was worth her attention and acting accordingly. Catherine Redmond was as temperamentally different from her brother as a person could be while sharing parents. Where James was loud and active and perpetually in motion, Catherine was quiet and observant and precise, and the combination of the two of them in the Red Fork's kitchen was something that Dave Castillo, who had become a kind of uncle to both of them, described as educational. Whitfield, who had been with the ranch for 6 years by this point, fell in love with a schoolteacher who arrived in Clarendon in the fall of 1891, a sensible young woman named Ada Morse who had come west from Kansas with her teaching certificate and a thorough disinclination to be romanticized. And Whit's courtship of her, conducted with an earnestness that was so complete it was almost impossible to watch without smiling, was one of the small joys of the Red Forks household for the better part of a year. He married her in the spring of 1892 and moved into a small house on the eastern boundary of the ranch that Thomas had helped him build, because a good hand who wanted to put down roots was worth keeping, and Thomas Redmond was the kind of employer who understood that. In the spring of 1892, Garrett, the neighbor to the north who had been carrying the debt to Thomas for years, came to the ranch in visible distress. His cattle operation had finally failed under the combination of poor grazing decisions and 2 harsh winters, and he was losing his land to the note he had borrowed against. He was 28 years old and had the look of a man who has been fighting a losing battle for so long he can no longer clearly remember what winning looked like. Thomas sat with him in the kitchen for 2 hours. Ellen stayed out of it, because she recognized that this was Thomas's territory to navigate in the way only he could, and because she trusted his judgment in these things completely. When Garrett left, he was not carrying the entire weight of despair he had arrived with, which meant Thomas had found something for him, some version of a way forward that left the man's dignity intact. "What did you work out?" Ellen asked that evening. "He'll work for us," Thomas said. Forfeit the debt in labor over 3 years. His claim will likely go to the land company, but he'll have a wage and a place while he decides what comes next. He poured himself coffee. His pride is hurt, but hurt pride heals if a man is given honest work and treated decently. Ellen looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, at the gray that had extended further into his dark hair in the 5 years since she had come to this ranch with an envelope and a debt to pay, at the lines around his eyes that were the lines of a man who squinted at sunlight and smiled more than he used to, at the face that had become, in 5 years of close acquaintance, the most familiar and the most important face in her world. "Do you know," she said, "that when I drove up to this porch in October of 1887 with my prepared words and my envelope, I was absolutely certain that I was going to hand you that money, say thank you, and drive away." Thomas looked at her with a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "I know," he said. "I thought I was coming to close something," she said. "What were you actually coming to do?" She considered this for a moment, the same kind of genuine consideration he had always given her questions, the same honesty she had promised herself she would always give him in return. "I think," she said slowly, "I was coming to find out whether the best thing that had ever happened to me was real or just a story I had been telling myself to survive everything else." Thomas set down his coffee and looked at her with the full weight of that gray-eyed attention that she had loved since before she admitted she loved it. "Was it real?" he asked. "More real than I had any right to expect," she said. He came around the table and took her face in his hands with great care, the way he handled things he valued, and he kissed her the way he had kissed her for 5 years, unhurried and without reservation, and Ellen Slater Redmond, who had survived a bad storm and a bad marriage, and a good marriage ended too soon and 3 days in a wagon with a rehearsed speech, and 31 years of learning to want less than she needed. Kissed him back with everything she had and held on to him and let the warmth of this particular life, this specific man, this unlikely and improbable and entirely true love, fill every room she had been keeping dark. The spring of 1893 brought rain, which in the Panhandle was never guaranteed and always celebrated when it came. The grass came in thick, and the Red Forks herd was strong, and James Redmond, who was 4 years old and had his father's eyes and his mother's way of saying exactly what he meant, announced firmly that he intended to have a horse of his own by summer, which Thomas negotiated down to assisted rides on Josephine, and a promise that when James was old enough, the first horse chosen would be truly his to name. Ellen had been corresponding with a woman in Clarendon named Margaret Elliott, who was attempting to establish a lending library for the town, and had donated a significant portion of George Slater's books to the effort, along with a financial contribution that had allowed Margaret to acquire a shelf and a half of additional volumes. This project had grown into a genuine friendship, and Margaret had become a regular visitor to the Red Fork, which gave Ellen the particular pleasure of a friendship conducted on her own terms, not defined by any husband's social connections or any town's expectations of what a rancher's wife ought to be interested in. The library in Clarendon opened its doors in the fall of 1893, in a 2-room building on the main street that Margaret had talked the town council into providing, and Ellen Redmond attended the opening with Thomas at her side, and Catherine on her hip and James straining at her hand to get to the books, and the pleasure of the afternoon was so complete and so specific that she stored it the way she stored the best things, in a place where it could not be lost. Dov Castillo, who had been with the Red Fork since before Ellen arrived, retired in the spring of 1894 with the quiet formality of a man who has given everything he had to a thing and knows when the thing is complete. Thomas paid him a sum that was considerably more generous than Dov had expected, and Dov, who did not express gratitude effusively, said only that he was glad he had stayed, which Thomas received as the high compliment it was. By the mid-1890s, the The Red Fork Ranch had become what Thomas had always intended it to be: a genuinely stable, genuinely successful small ranching operation that provided well for the people who lived and worked on it, that did not extract its success from anyone else's failure, and that sat on the land it occupied with the same understated permanence as the grass itself. The name Redmond was known in Clarendon and beyond as belonging to people who dealt fairly and built well and meant what they said. Ellen continued to write. Her letters to the newspapers had become more occasional but more substantive, and she had begun corresponding with a woman in Abilene who was organizing a network of ranch women across the territory to advocate for better educational opportunities in rural areas, because the schooling available to children who lived 40 or 50 miles from the nearest town was, in Ellen's precise written estimation, inadequate and correctable. And inadequate correctable things were Ellen Redmond's particular territory. Thomas Redmond read her letters before she sent them, not to approve them, because he never tried to manage what she thought or said, but because he was genuinely interested in what she was thinking, and because he had come to consider her written voice one of the things he was most grateful for in his life, which he had told her once in a way that surprised her into silence for a full minute. In the autumn of 1895, Ellen discovered she was carrying their third child, which arrived in the following spring as another boy. They named him William, for reasons that were partly traditional and partly because James, who had opinions about everything, had lobbied for this name with an intensity that was difficult to argue against. William Redmond arrived quieter than his brother and louder than his sister, which placed him in a comfortable middle position, and he had Ellen's coloring where James and Catherine had their fathers, which gave Ellen a particular and slightly guilty private pleasure. The year 1896 also brought a development that required careful attention. One of the large Fort Worth land companies that had been consolidating Panhandle acreage for 20 years sent a representative to the Red Fork with an offer to purchase. The offer was substantial, enough to be genuinely tempting to anyone who was not entirely certain of what they were doing on this land and why. And the representative, a smooth-mannered man named Holt who smelled of city and commission, delivered it with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to closing deals. Thomas heard him out with complete attention and no discernible reaction. When Holt finished, Thomas thanked him for the visit, offered him coffee, which Holt declined, and said that the Red Fork was not for sale. Holt made the offer larger. Thomas said the same thing. Holt suggested that the offer would not remain open indefinitely, and that the land company's intentions in the region were significant, and that a man who did not take an offer at the right time sometimes found his circumstances changed in ways he had not anticipated. Thomas stood up and opened the door for the man. When Holt was gone, Ellen, who had been at the kitchen table throughout with her accounts book, looked at Thomas with a question in her eyes. "Implied threat," he said simply. "I know," she said. "What do we do?" Thomas sat back down and wrapped his hands around his coffee cup in the way he always did when he was thinking something through. "We make sure our water rights are documented to perfection," he said. "We make sure Witt's arrangement is in writing with no gaps. We contact Brower's lawyer about the purchase agreement and make sure it's properly recorded." He looked at her. "And we write some letters." Ellen smiled. "I'll sharpen my pen," she said. The land company made 2 more approaches over the following year, neither of which produced a different result, and by 1898 it had moved its attentions to more tractable territory. The Red Fork had outlasted the pressure by the simple method of having nothing that could be pressured, no debt to threaten, no gap in the paperwork, no uncertainty about the intentions of its owners. Thomas Brower died in the winter of 1897 at the age of 73, exactly as he had predicted to Thomas and Ellen the previous spring, with the precision of a man who has stopped being surprised by his body's reports. The land transfer that had been agreed upon was processed without complication, and the Eastern Range became part of the Red Fork formally, with the Brower name attached to it in the deed as a named parcel, exactly as the old man had asked. Ellen stood at the graveside in the frozen December grass of Clarendon Cemetery and thought about what Brower had said to her in the kitchen of the Red Fork when they had agreed to the arrangement, that the land had a dark past and needed good people. She thought about what it meant to be a good person for a particular piece of land, about the specific relationship between a human life and the specific ground it was lived on, about the way the Red Fork's grass had looked the first morning she woke up here, golden in the October sun and going off to forever, and the way it looked now, familiar and indispensable. James, who was 9 years old and had been permitted to attend the funeral because he had liked old Brower greatly, and the liking had been thoroughly returned, stood beside her with his father's stillness and her mother's directness and said quietly, "Will the land still be called Brower's Range?" "Always," Ellen said. James nodded with the finality of a child who has got the answer that resolves the question. Christmas of 1897 was the largest gathering the Red Fork Ranch had ever hosted. Ellen had made it a tradition, in the years since their marriage, to bring people in for the holiday, because the isolation of the Panhandle in December could be complete and crushing for people who were alone, and because she had been alone in December herself in years, she preferred not to think about too directly, and she understood what it cost. Whit and Ada came with their baby daughter, born in August and named Louise, who tolerated the noise of the gathering with an equanimity that Ada said she was going to need, because Whit came from a large family and apparently could not help trying to recreate one. Garrett, who had worked off his debt to Thomas 2 years prior and had stayed on in a reduced capacity by mutual agreement, because he was genuinely good with horses, and the Red Fork had a horse program now, came and was quiet but present. Margaret Elliott from Clarendon came with her husband, a taciturn but decent man who was deeply grateful to his wife's friendship with Ellen for the change it had made in his wife's sense of the world. A couple of other neighboring families, whose children were friends with James and Catherine, filled out the table. Thomas, who was not by nature a man who needed or sought large gatherings, managed this particular annual event with a grace that Ellen appreciated because she understood what it cost him. He moved through the crowded kitchen and the busy parlor and the porch where the men stood in coats drinking coffee and talking about the winter range, and he was present with each person in the particular way he had always been present with her, the full attention, the genuine interest, the complete absence of performance. She watched him from across the room and felt the same thing she had felt for 10 years now, since the second morning of her visit when she had leaned on the fence watching him work the young horse in the corral, the thing that she had spent years trying to call debt and gratitude and had finally, at 31 on a December porch full of stars, been willing to name as love. It had not diminished. That was the thing she had wondered about in the early years, whether the particular intensity of their beginning, the long-owed debt and the forgotten kindness and the 3 weeks of revelation, had been a kind of fever that would cool into ordinary life. It had not. It had deepened the way a river deepens as it moves further from its source, carrying more with it as it went, quieter on the surface but moving with more force. They were, she thought, extraordinarily fortunate. Not in the way of people who had avoided hard things because they had not avoided them, but in the way of people who had found the specific partnership that made hard things navigable. They had built something together, the ranch and the family and the daily life of it, that was neither hers nor his but genuinely theirs, made of the joining of 2 very different histories into a single going forward. In the late evening of that Christmas, when the guests had gone and the children were asleep and the kitchen had been set to rights and the ranch was quiet under the winter stars, Ellen and Thomas sat on the south porch under blankets as they had sat on the second night she was here, 10 years ago now, nearly to the month. "This is the same porch," she said. "It is," he agreed. "And the same blanket, I think." Thomas looked at the blanket. "Different blanket, same chair." "I sat in this chair that second night and thought that I had absolutely no idea what I was doing here," Ellen said. and that I was not in the least sorry I had stayed. I sat in that chair, Thomas said, nodding at the other one, and thought that I was going to say something completely foolish if I didn't get myself under control. Ellen looked at him with a smile that went all the way down. You were extremely controlled. I was terrified, he said mildly. Of what? He considered this for a moment in the way he always considered things. Of being wrong about what I thought was happening, he said. I had been wrong before, the woman in Canyon. I thought I knew what was between us, and I had not known. The idea of being wrong again, of reaching for something that wasn't there, he paused. That was the thing that could have broken me. Ellen reached across the space between the two chairs and found his hand under the blanket. I am so glad you reached anyway, she said. Thomas Redmond turned his hand over and held hers with the warm, steady grip that she had been holding onto for 10 years, the grip that meant everything she had needed a grip to mean, from a root cellar in a spring storm to this porch in a winter night. You came to return a kindness, he said quietly. I did, she said, and I said I had forgotten. You lied, she said gently. I was trying to let you go, he said. I thought I did not want you to feel obligated to stay. I was trying to clear the debt so you could leave cleanly. He squeezed her hand. I thought that was the honest thing. What was the honest thing, she said, was everything that happened afterward. Yes, he agreed. It was. The stars over the Panhandle were what they always were on a clear winter night, which was to say extraordinary, the entire weight of the universe's brilliance overhead, with no competing light for 100 miles in any direction. Ellen had grown up in Missouri with a sky reduced by trees and towns, and she had thought for years that she missed that sky, that closed-in familiar sky of her childhood. She did not miss it anymore. She had a different sky now, one that required you to be large enough to sit under it without flinching, and she had learned exactly that large. James Redmond would grow up on this land and would have the opinions and the capability and the integrity of both his parents in particular and distinct combinations. Catherine Redmond would grow up on this land and would have her mother's written voice and her father's patience, and would do things with both that neither parent fully anticipated. William Redmond would grow up on this land with the easy certainty of a person who has never known a time when the land was not his, which was both a privilege and an inheritance, and which his parents discussed with the seriousness it deserved, because they knew what it meant to have the land and to have built it, and to owe that knowledge to generations of other people's work and displacement. The Red Fork Ranch would stand for another century. It would pass from Thomas and Ellen to their children, and from their children to their children's children, and the name Redmond would remain on that Panhandle grass long after everyone who remembered the envelope and the prepared speech and the second night porch conversation was gone. The Brower Range would keep its name as the deed had promised. The water rights would remain clear and documented. The library in Clarendon, which Ellen had helped establish, would outlast everyone involved in its founding, and would carry its small illumination forward into a future none of them could see. But all of that was ahead of them, and they could not know it, sitting here under the winter stars of 1897, with the children asleep inside, and the ranch quiet and the blankets against the cold. What they had was the present, the porch and the stars and the joined hands and the life they had built from the most improbable of beginnings, from a bad storm and a dark root cellar, and a man who had come off a horse at a run because a woman needed help and there was no reason not to help her, and a woman who had carried that afternoon inside her for 9 years before she was free to go looking for the man who had given it to her. You know, Ellen said into the comfortable silence of long marriage and deep knowing, I never did give you that money. Thomas made a sound that was half laugh and half something warmer. You put it toward the ranch. Toward the ranch we were going to build together, she said. That is not the same as giving it to you. No, he agreed. It's considerably better. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was a thing she had done 10,000 times by now and which still felt like the specific and unrepeatable thing it had been the first time. Thomas, she said. Ellen, he said. "I am very glad you were on the wrong fork that afternoon." His arm came around her shoulders and settled there with the weight of permanence. "So am I," he said. "Every single day, so am I." The Panhandle night pressed its enormous quiet down over the Red Fork Ranch, over the sleeping children and the warm house and the good corrals, and the grass going off to the horizon in every direction, over the two people sitting on the south porch with the stars overhead and their whole long life behind them, and enough of it still ahead to make the future a thing of genuine and grounded hope. And it said what it always said, which was nothing, and which was everything, and which was exactly as much as two people who had found each other needed to hear. All storms passed. This was what Thomas Redmond had told a woman in a root cellar in the spring of 1878, in the dark with the wind trying to peel the world apart overhead. And it was true. It had always been true, not as a comfort or a platitude, but as a simple and foundational fact, the kind that held the weight of a life if you let it. All storms passed, and what the storm left behind, if you were paying attention, if you were willing to look at what the cleared air revealed, was occasionally something more valuable than what had stood before it. A man who remembered, a woman who came back. A life built in the wide and unforgiving and utterly honest light of the Texas Panhandle, on grass that had seen everything and forgot nothing, between two people who had looked at each other across a kitchen table with an envelope between them and recognized in the space of 3 weeks and 100 small true things the shape of the life they had always been meant to be living. That was the kindness returned, not the money, not the prepared speech, not the clean completion of a ledger. This, all of this. This was the thing she had come to give him, and the thing he had already been holding for her all along.